The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302 at the Municipal Court of Boston, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, and Dr. Maya Thompson sat quietly in the back row, reviewing documents on her tablet while waiting for her case to be called. She hadn't planned to spend her morning in traffic court, especially with a crucial Federal Reserve meeting scheduled for the afternoon. But here she was, determined to contest what she knew was an incorrect traffic citation. Maya had worn her casual clothes, jeans, a simple black sweater, and comfortable flats, since she hadn't expected to go to the office that day. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. Court officers directed people to their seats, lawyers hurried in and out with their briefcases, and Judge Richard Barrett's clerk organized the day's cases. Judge Barrett himself sat elevated behind his massive wooden bench, his gray hair neatly combed, his black robe pristine, as he worked through the morning's traffic violations with mechanical efficiency. Case number 2347, Maya Thompson, the clerk called out, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Maya stood up, gathered her materials, and walked confidently to the podium. She noticed how Judge Barrett barely looked up from his papers, his eyes scanning her citation with the weariness of someone who'd seen thousands of similar cases. Ms. Thompson, Judge Barrett began, emphasizing the Ms. with a slightly condescending tone. You're here for running a stop sign at the intersection of Maple and 4th Street on March 15th. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Maya replied calmly, her voice clear and steady. She reached into her folder to pull out her evidence, but Judge Barrett cut her off with a wave of his hand. Miss Thompson, he sighed, removing his reading glasses and fixing her with a stern look. Do you know how many people come through this court claiming they didn't run a stop sign? The officer's report clearly states you made a rolling stop, which, let me inform you, is the same as running the sign. Maya tried again. Your Honor, if I could just show you the evidence I prepared. Young lady, Judge Barrett interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. I have a full docket today. The fine for this violation is $500. If you pay within 30 days, we can avoid any additional penalties. Consider this a lesson in respecting traffic laws. The judge's dismissive tone drew curious glances from the lawyers and other defendants in the courtroom. A young law clerk in the corner looked uncomfortable, shifting papers on her desk unnecessarily. Maya stood straight, her expression composed despite the judge's patronizing attitude. She was used to being underestimated, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. With deliberate movements, she pulled out her business card and credentials. Your Honor, she began again, her voice taking on the same authoritative tone she used when presenting to the Federal Reserve Board. I'm Dr. Maya Thompson, Chief Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. I have video evidence from my dashboard camera showing that I made a complete stop, along with a statistical analysis of traffic patterns at that intersection. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Barrett's hand froze mid-signature on the violation ticket. He slowly looked up, really seeing Maya for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom. His eyes widened slightly as he read the credentials she placed before him. The same law clerk who had looked uncomfortable earlier was now trying to hide a smile behind her hand. The court officer by the door stood a little straighter, suddenly paying close attention to the proceedings. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet courtroom. The morning sun had shifted, and now it fell directly on his face, highlighting the beads of sweat that had begun to form on his forehead. Dr. Thompson, he said, his tone markedly different from before. Perhaps you'd like to present your evidence after all. Maya nodded calmly, though inside she felt a familiar mix of satisfaction and sadness. It shouldn't take impressive credentials for a black woman to be treated with respect in a courtroom, but here they were. As she began setting up her presentation, she could feel the energy in the room shift. The other defendants sat up straighter, the lawyers stopped shuffling their papers, and even the court reporter leaned forward slightly. Judge Barrett's earlier dismissiveness had disappeared, replaced by an attentiveness that should have been there from the start. The real lesson was about to begin, and it had nothing to do with traffic laws. Judge Barrett tried to maintain his composure as Dr. Thompson connected her tablet to the courtroom's display system. The large screen behind him came to life, showing a crystal-clear dashboard camera video. The morning's earlier confidence had deserted him, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Several attorneys who had been waiting for their cases lingered in the back of the courtroom, suddenly finding this simple traffic violation case far more interesting than their phone calls. The whispers had already started, traveling from row to row like a gentle breeze. "I have prepared several pieces of evidence, Your Honor," Dr. Thompson began, her voice steady and professional. "First, let's examine the video footage from March 15th. The video played, showing her car coming to a complete stop at the intersection of Maple and 4th Street. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner, matching the exact time listed on the citation. The stop lasted for a full 3 seconds before she proceeded through the intersection." Judge Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The evidence was irrefutable, but his earlier behavior made him reluctant to immediately dismiss the case. That would be too obvious an admission of his prejudiced treatment. "Even so, Ms. Dr. Thompson," he corrected himself quickly, "the officer's testimony. I prepared a statistical analysis of traffic patterns at this intersection as well." Dr. Thompson continued smoothly, switching to the next slide. Complex graphs and charts appeared on the screen. "Over the past 6 months, there has been a 47% increase in traffic citations at this particular stop sign, predominantly issued to minority drivers." The courtroom fell even quieter, if that was possible. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, and the bailiff tried to maintain a neutral expression but failed. Judge Barrett's face had turned a shade paler. "Furthermore," Dr. Thompson continued, pulling out a thick folder, "I've compiled data from traffic cameras showing that white drivers at this intersection receive warnings 68% of the time, while black and Hispanic drivers receive citations 89% of the time for the same offense." Judge Barrett gripped his gavel tightly, his knuckles turning white. The $500 fine he had so casually imposed earlier now felt like a weight around his neck. He had assumed she was just another defendant trying to waste the court's time, and now his bias was being exposed with mathematical precision. "Dr. Thompson," he began, his voice notably softer than before, "this is quite thorough research for a traffic citation." "As an economist, Your Honor, I believe in data," she replied calmly. "When I received this citation, I knew something wasn't right. At the Federal Reserve, we analyze patterns to understand underlying problems. The same principle applies here." The young law clerk was now openly watching with admiration, her legal pad forgotten. Other defendants in the courtroom were sitting forward, many of them people of color who had faced similar treatment. Judge Barrett looked at the fine notice still sitting on his bench, the one he had been ready to sign without a second thought. His earlier words about teaching respect for the law now rang hollow in his ears. "Dr. Thompson," he said, clearing his throat, "given the evidence you presented." But she wasn't finished. She pulled up one final slide showing the comprehensive breakdown of traffic stops in the district over the past year, categorized by race, time of day, and outcome. The numbers told a story that no one in the courtroom could ignore. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "I'm not just here about a $500 fine. I'm here because patterns matter, and the data suggests a systematic issue that needs addressing." The morning sun had shifted again, and now the whole courtroom seemed brighter, more exposed. Judge Barrett looked around at the faces watching him, the other defendants, the attorneys, his own staff. He saw their expressions, their expectations, and most importantly, their hope for justice. The fine notice sat untouched on his bench, a simple piece of paper that had turned into something much more significant. In trying to teach someone a lesson about respect for the law, Judge Barrett was about to learn one himself. "Dr. Thompson," he said finally, "I believe it's time we had a serious discussion about these findings." The tension in the courtroom shifted to anticipation. The next few moments would determine not just the outcome of a simple traffic citation, but potentially the beginning of a larger change in their local justice system. The atmosphere in courtroom 302 had transformed completely from the routine morning session it had been just 30 minutes ago. Dr. Maya Thompson stood confidently at the podium, her presentation now shifting to her professional credentials and expertise. "Your Honor," she began, pulling up her curriculum vitae on the display screen, "before we discuss the broader implications of these traffic stop patterns, I should properly introduce myself." The screen showed her impressive academic and professional history, causing several audible gasps from the gallery. Judge Barrett leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he read through her accomplishments. BA in Economics from Yale, summa cum laude, 50D in economic policy from Harvard. Former White House economic advisor, current chief economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. The list seemed endless. As the head economist at the Federal Reserve, Dr. Thompson continued, her voice calm but authoritative. I spend my days analyzing patterns that affect our nation's economic policies. When I noticed similarities between economic discrimination and traffic stop patterns in our district, I couldn't ignore it. The young law clerk had abandoned all pretense of working and was now taking rapid notes. Several attorneys in the back had pulled out their phones, quietly searching Dr. Thompson's name online. Their eyes widened as they found articles about her recent testimonies before Congress and her influential papers on economic inequality. Judge Barrett's earlier condescending demeanor had completely evaporated. He sat up straighter, his face a mixture of embarrassment and growing respect. The woman he had tried to dismiss with a simple fine was regularly consulted by government officials and international financial institutions. Dr. Thompson, he said, his voice notably different from his earlier tone, your credentials are extraordinary. But more importantly, your analysis of our traffic stop patterns is concerning. Thank you, Your Honor, she replied. I've actually been working on a broader study examining the economic impact of biased traffic enforcement on working-class communities. This personal experience has provided valuable first-hand insight into my research. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the sound of papers shuffling seemed loud. Other defendants waiting for their cases watched with a mixture of awe and hope. Many of them had similar stories but lacked the credentials to make their voices heard. A reporter from the local newspaper, who happened to be covering another case, had started furiously taking notes. This was no longer a simple traffic court story. It was about to become a spotlight on systemic bias in the justice system. Would you be willing to share your complete findings with the court? Judge Barrett asked, trying to regain some professional footing. This kind of data could be invaluable for improving our system. Dr. Thompson nodded, pulling out a thick manila envelope. I prepared comprehensive reports for the court, including comparative analysis from other districts that have successfully addressed similar issues. The bailiff collected the envelope and handed it to Judge Barrett, who opened it with visible interest. As he skimmed the first few pages, his expression grew increasingly serious. This is thorough work, Dr. Thompson, he admitted. The kind of analysis that could lead to meaningful changes in our procedures. A small smile appeared on Dr. Thompson's face, not one of triumph, but of hope. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, Your Honor. Sometimes it takes an unexpected perspective to identify systemic problems. The other defendants in the courtroom were now watching with renewed attention. Many had their own stories of unfair treatment, but none had been able to present their cases with such compelling evidence and authority. Judge Barrett looked at the fine notice still sitting unsigned on his bench, then back at Dr. Thompson's credentials on the screen. The contrast between his initial judgment and the reality of who stood before him couldn't have been starker. Dr. Thompson, he said finally, I believe we owe you not just an apology, but also our gratitude. Your analysis has brought to light issues that demand our immediate attention. The morning sun now streamed fully through the courtroom windows, illuminating Dr. Thompson as she stood at the podium. She had come to court expecting to fight a simple traffic ticket, but had instead opened the door to a much larger conversation about justice and equality. The revelation of her identity and expertise had done more than just change the outcome of her case. It had cracked open a window into systemic issues that could no longer be ignored. Judge Richard Barrett sat in his chambers during the hastily called recess, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed Dr. Thompson's comprehensive report. The morning's events kept replaying in his mind, his dismissive attitude, the condescending tone he had used, and the remarkable way Dr. Thompson had handled it all. Through his office window, he could see reporters gathering outside the courthouse. News traveled fast in the digital age, and word of what had transpired in his courtroom was already spreading through legal circles. His phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from colleagues and court administrators. Your Honor. His clerk, Sarah, knocked gently on the door. The Chief Judge would like to speak with you when you have a moment. Her expression carried a mix of concern and something else. Disappointment, perhaps. Barrett nodded, loosening his collar as he continued reading through Dr. Thompson's analysis. The statistics were undeniable. Page after page showed clear patterns of bias in traffic stops, fines, and judicial treatment. What struck him hardest was realizing how his own behavior that morning perfectly exemplified the problem. 20 years on the bench, he muttered to himself, and I never saw it. But that wasn't entirely true. He hadn't wanted to see it. It had been easier to process cases quickly, to make assumptions, to fall back on unconscious biases that made his job simpler, but justice harder. The faces of countless defendants who had stood before him over the years flashed through his mind. How many Dr. Thompsons had he dismissed without a second thought? How many valid arguments had he ignored because of his preconceptions? On his desk sat a framed photo of himself taking the judicial oath, his hand raised as he swore to administer justice fairly and impartially. The younger version of himself in that picture looked back at him accusingly. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The courthouse media liaison, Robert Chen, entered with a concerned expression. Judge Barrett, we have several media requests for comment. The Boston Globe is running a story, and Channel 5 News is outside. They're calling it The Economist and the Judge already. Barrett took off his reading glasses and rubbed his temples. How many people were in the courtroom this morning, Robert? Full gallery, sir, including 3 law students who were observing court proceedings. They'd already posted about it on social media. The judge nodded slowly. His humbling wasn't just personal, it was public. And maybe that was necessary. Change rarely came from comfortable places. He looked down at Dr. Thompson's business card on his desk. She hadn't just proven her innocence. She had handed him an opportunity. The question was whether he would have the courage to take it. Robert, he said finally, arrange a press conference for tomorrow morning. And get me a meeting with the chief judge and the district attorney's office. We need to discuss implementing new training programs. Yes, sir, Robert replied, looking relieved. And about Dr. Thompson's case? I'll be dismissing it formally when court resumes, Barrett said. But more importantly, I'll be asking for her help in reviewing our entire traffic court system. As Robert left, Barrett stood and walked to his window. The gathering media crowd reminded him of something Dr. Thompson had said about patterns. His pattern of behavior had been exposed today, but so had a chance to break it. His computer screen showed several new emails, one from a judicial oversight committee, another from a civil rights organization, and surprisingly, one from Dr. Thompson herself. She had attached additional research papers on bias in the justice system, offering to discuss them at his convenience. The clock on his wall showed it was time to return to court. Barrett straightened his robe and gathered Dr. Thompson's reports. His hands had stopped trembling. The morning's embarrassment was transforming into determination. Sarah, he called to his clerk as he prepared to return to the courtroom, clear my calendar for next week. We have work to do. As he walked back toward his courtroom, Barrett felt the weight of every decision he had ever made on the bench. But for the first time in years, he also felt the possibility of real change. Change that had started with a simple traffic ticket and a remarkable woman who refused to be dismissed. The afternoon session would be different. Judge Barrett was different now. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the most unexpected teachers, and Dr. Maya Thompson had taught him more in one morning than 20 years of legal experience. By early afternoon, the steps of the Boston Municipal Court had become a makeshift press area. Reporters clustered in small groups, their cameras and microphones ready, while curious onlookers gathered behind them. The morning's routine traffic court session had transformed into something much more newsworthy. Sarah Chen, a veteran reporter from the Boston Globe, stood at the top of the courthouse steps, interviewing witnesses who had been present during the morning session. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her editor, demanding updates on what was quickly becoming the day's biggest local story. It was incredible, explained Marcus Rodriguez, a law student who had been observing court proceedings. Dr. Thompson didn't just defend herself, she exposed an entire system of bias with pure data. You should have seen Judge Barrett's face when she revealed who she was. Inside the courthouse cafeteria, clerks and attorneys huddled around tables, discussing the morning's events. Phones displayed Dr. Thompson's impressive profile on the Federal Reserve's website, alongside her numerous published works on economic inequality. I've appeared in Barrett's court dozens of times, said public defender Maria Santos, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. He's always been, let's say, quick to judge. But this morning might actually change things around here. The courthouse security guards had their hands full managing the growing crowd outside. Local community leaders had begun arriving, sensing an opportunity to address long-standing concerns about judicial bias. Reverend James Wilson, a prominent civil rights activist, was giving interviews near the courthouse entrance. What Dr. Thompson did today wasn't just about one traffic ticket, Reverend Wilson explained to a cluster of reporters. She used her position and expertise to shine a light on something our community has been trying to talk about for years. Up in the court administrative offices, phones rang constantly. The chief judge's secretary fielded calls from other district courts, legal organizations, and even the state's Supreme Judicial Court. Everyone wanted to know more about the Economist who had turned a simple traffic court appearance into a watershed moment. Social media was buzzing with activity. Law students who had witnessed the morning session shared their accounts online, and the hashtag Economist in court was trending locally. Screenshots of Dr. Thompson's credentials and research papers circulated widely, alongside discussions about bias in the justice system. Back in the main corridor, court officers Jerry Martinez and Lisa O'Neill maintained their posts while discussing the morning's events in hushed tones. 20 years on this job, Martinez said, shaking his head in amazement, and I've never seen anything like it. The way she presented those statistics, it was like watching someone perform surgery on the whole system. O'Neill nodded in agreement. Did you see how many other defendants stayed to watch? Usually, people can't wait to leave traffic court, but today, they'd all wanted to see what would happen next. In the law library, 3 junior clerks huddled around a computer, pulling up Dr. Thompson's published papers on economic discrimination. The youngest clerk, David Kim, was particularly excited. Look at this, he whispered to his colleagues, pointing at the screen. She's been studying the economic impact of biased law enforcement for years. This wasn't just about her ticket. She was prepared to address the bigger issue. Outside Judge Barrett's chambers, his senior clerk fielded calls from national news organizations. CNN wanted a statement. The New York Times was preparing a feature story. What had started as a local courthouse drama was rapidly expanding into a national conversation about judicial bias and systemic reform. Dr. Thompson herself had returned to her office at the Federal Reserve, where her colleagues gathered around her desk, reading the rapidly multiplying news reports about the morning's events. Only you would turn a traffic ticket into a teaching moment about systemic bias, her assistant remarked with admiration. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived at the courthouse. Community activists, legal observers, curious citizens. They all wanted to witness what would happen when court resumed. Would Judge Barrett formally apologize? Would real changes be implemented? The story had struck a chord because it represented something larger than one judge's bias or one economist's vindication. It highlighted how expertise and evidence could challenge assumptions, how privilege and prejudice could be exposed by data, and how justice might actually work when those in power were forced to confront their own biases. The public interest wasn't just about the morning's dramatic revelation. It was about the possibility of real change in a system that touched everyone's lives. And it had all started with a traffic ticket and a judge's mistaken assumption about the woman who stood before him. When court resumed at 2:30 p.m., courtroom 302 was packed to capacity. Court officers had to turn people away at the door, directing them to an overflow room where the proceedings would be shown on closed-circuit television. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the now crowded gallery. Judge Barrett entered the courtroom, his usual confident stride replaced by a more measured pace. The customary all-rise announcement echoed through the room, but today it felt different. As he took his seat, his eyes swept across the packed gallery, noting the presence of reporters, community leaders, and dozens of ordinary citizens. Dr. Maya Thompson sat in the front row, composed and dignified in her simple black sweater. Next to her sat her colleague from the Federal Reserve, who had rushed over after hearing about the morning's events. The room fell silent as Judge Barrett cleared his throat. Before we proceed with the afternoon docket, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, I need to address what occurred this morning. He removed his reading glasses, a gesture that made him look older and more vulnerable than he had appeared just hours ago. Dr. Thompson, he said, looking directly at her, would you please approach the bench? Maya rose gracefully and walked to the podium where she had stood that morning. The clicking of news cameras provided a quiet backdrop to her footsteps. Dr. Thompson, this morning I made several serious errors in judgment. Judge Barrett continued. I allowed preconceptions and bias to cloud my judicial responsibility. I treated you with disrespect, not only as a defendant but as a human being. The courtroom remained absolutely still. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased. Every person present knew they were witnessing something rare in the judicial system, a genuine admission of bias and a public apology. Your research and presentation this morning did more than just prove your innocence, he continued. They expose systematic issues that demand immediate attention. I want to apologize not just for my treatment of you, but for every defendant who has stood before me and faced similar bias. Dr. Thompson nodded slightly, acknowledging his words while maintaining her professional demeanor. Furthermore, Judge Barrett added, I am formally dismissing your citation, but more importantly, I am establishing a judicial review committee to examine bias in our traffic court system. Dr. Thompson, given your expertise in data analysis and systemic inequality, I would like to formally request your assistance in this endeavor. A murmur ran through the courtroom. This was more than an apology. It was a commitment to change. Your Honor, Dr. Thompson responded, her voice clear and measured, I accept your apology. More importantly, I accept your invitation to help reform the system. Change begins with acknowledgement, and you've taken that first crucial step. Judge Barrett nodded, visibly moved by her gracious response. I am also announcing mandatory anti-bias training for all court personnel, including myself. We cannot claim to serve justice while allowing unconscious prejudices to influence our decisions. Reverend Wilson, sitting in the back row, nodded approvingly. Several other community leaders exchanged meaningful glances. This was the kind of institutional acknowledgement they had been seeking for years. Dr. Thompson's experience this morning, Judge Barrett continued, while regrettable, has provided us with an opportunity to examine our practices, confront our biases, and work toward a more equitable system of justice. He picked up his gavel but paused before bringing it down. Let the record show that on this day, this court commits itself to real and measurable change. We will be transparent in our efforts and accountable for our progress. The gavel struck with a decisive crack, sealing the commitment. Dr. Thompson gathered her materials, exchanged a meaningful look with Judge Barrett, and returned to her seat. As she walked back, several people reached out to touch her arm or whisper thanks. Court officers began organizing the afternoon docket, but everyone knew that business as usual had changed forever in courtroom 302. Judge Barrett's apology wasn't just about one morning's interaction. It was an acknowledgement of a deeper problem and a pledge to address it. As the afternoon session officially began, reporters slipped out to file their stories, and community leaders began making calls to organize follow-up meetings. Dr. Thompson's simple traffic court appearance had transformed into something none of them had expected, a catalyst for systematic change in the Boston judicial system. The apology was just the beginning. The real work of transformation lay ahead. 3 weeks after the courtroom incident, Dr. Maya Thompson sat in her office at the Federal Reserve, reviewing the stack of invitations and requests that had accumulated on her desk. The morning sun glinted off her Woman of the Year nomination letter from the Massachusetts Bar Association, while her computer inbox blinked with unread messages from law schools requesting guest lectures. The local newspaper had dubbed it the traffic stop that changed Boston, and the ripple effects continued to spread. Dr. Thompson picked up the Boston Globe, where her story still made headlines. Federal Reserve Economist sparks judicial reform movement. Her assistant, James, knocked on the door with yet another update. The governor's office called again. They want you to chair the new state commission on judicial equality, and Harvard Law School has requested your traffic court analysis for their civil rights curriculum. Maya nodded, adding these to her growing list of commitments. Her simple drive to work that March morning had somehow transformed into a movement for change. She glanced at the framed copy of her dismissed traffic ticket, now hanging on her office wall, a reminder of how unexpected moments could lead to meaningful change. Across town at the courthouse, Judge Barrett was conducting the first session of mandatory anti-bias training for court personnel. The normally austere conference room was filled with judges, clerks, and officers, all watching as experts presented data on unconscious bias in the justice system. The numbers don't lie, Barrett explained to his colleagues, some of whom looked uncomfortable. Dr. Thompson's analysis showed us what we refused to see ourselves. Now it's our responsibility to act on that knowledge. The changes were already visible in the courthouse. New signs in multiple languages help people navigate the building. Court clerks received training in cultural sensitivity. A team of data analysts began reviewing years of court records, looking for patterns of bias in sentencing and fines. Local community organizations reported a shift in how their members were treated in traffic court. Maria Santos, the public defender, noticed judges taking more time with each case, listening more carefully to explanations and circumstances. It's not perfect yet, she told a community meeting, but there's a different atmosphere now. People feel heard. They feel respected. The story had caught national attention too. Other cities began examining their own traffic court practices. Legal scholars cited the Thompson effect when discussing how data analysis could expose systemic bias in the justice system. At the Federal Reserve, Dr. Thompson's colleagues marveled at how she balanced her regular economic duties with her new role as a catalyst for judicial reform. She had become a sought-after speaker at legal conferences, where her combination of economic expertise and personal experience brought a unique perspective to discussions of systemic bias. "You've started something important," her department head told her during the meeting. "Your economic analysis skills revealed what years of legal arguments couldn't quite prove." Back at the courthouse, the young law clerk who had witnessed the original incident now led tours for law students, showing them the famous courtroom 302. "This is where Dr. Thompson presented her analysis," she would explain. "She showed us that justice isn't just about laws, it's about recognizing and correcting our biases." Community leaders noticed other changes too. Reverend Wilson reported fewer complaints about traffic court bias from his congregation. The local NAACP chapter noted a significant decrease in calls about unfair treatment at traffic stops. One afternoon, as Dr. Thompson left a Judicial Review Committee meeting, she passed a woman leaving traffic court. The woman recognized her from the news coverage and stopped her. "Thank you," the woman said simply. "Today, the judge listened to my explanation, really listened. That wouldn't have happened before you spoke up." Maya smiled, remembering her own day in court. The incident had never been about just one traffic ticket or one judge's bias. It was about using data and expertise to expose systemic problems and create meaningful change. As she drove home that evening, she stopped at the same intersection where her story had begun. The stop sign stood as it always had, but now it represented something different. A moment when one person's refusal to accept unfair treatment had sparked a movement for change. The aftermath of that morning in traffic court continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing systems in ways Dr. Thompson had never imagined when she decided to contest a simple traffic ticket. Sometimes, she reflected, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of standing up for what's right. 6 months after the memorable morning in courtroom 302, the Boston Municipal Court held a special session to present its first judicial bias impact report. The grand courthouse, usually quiet by late afternoon, buzzed with activity as community leaders, legal professionals, and media representatives filled the main assembly hall. Dr. Maya Thompson sat in the front row, reviewing her presentation notes. The data from the past 6 months told a powerful story of transformation. Next to her, Judge Barrett, now the head of the court's anti-bias initiative, adjusted his tie nervously. "Ready for this?" Maya asked him quietly. "Thanks to you, we all are," he replied, managing a small smile. The Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court took the podium first. 6 months ago, a chance encounter in a traffic court sparked a revolution in our judicial system. Today, we share the results of that change. The large screen behind her displayed the statistics. Traffic court fines had become more equitable across all demographics. The number of successfully appealed citations have dropped by 40%. Community satisfaction with court interactions had improved by 65%. When it was Dr. Thompson's turn to speak, she walked to the podium amid warm applause. The economist who had once been dismissed in traffic court now commanded the attention of the entire state's judicial leadership. "Change isn't just about numbers," she began, though the numbers tell an important story. "Real change happens in small moments, in daily interactions, in the ways we choose to see and hear each other. She clicked to the next slide, showing the dramatic reduction in biased citations. The courthouse staff had undergone extensive training, and every judge now had a bias awareness monitor on their bench, a small digital display showing real-time statistics about their decisions. Judge Barrett's initiative had spread beyond Boston. Courts in 5 other major cities had adopted similar programs, using data analysis to identify and address systemic bias. The Thompson method, as it had become known, was being studied in law schools across the country. But perhaps the most significant change, Maya continued, is the one we can't measure in numbers. She gestured to the back of the hall, where dozens of citizens stood, each holding a sign with their own courthouse story. It's the change in how people feel when they enter our courts, whether they believe justice is truly blind. The presentation included testimonials from court employees. The young clerk who had witnessed the original incident now led the court's community outreach program. Court officers reported more positive interactions with the public. Even the parking attendants noticed a difference in how people arrived, less anxious, more confident. Judge Barrett took the podium next, his demeanor markedly different from the man who had presided in courtroom 302 6 months ago. Dr. Thompson taught us that justice isn't just about following laws, he said. It's about examining our assumptions, challenging our biases, and having the courage to change. He announced the establishment of the Thompson Fellowship, a program funding economists and data scientists to study bias in legal systems nationwide. The first year's budget had already been approved, with support from both state and federal agencies. As the session concluded, Maya watched people mingling in the hall, judges chatting with community activists, lawyers discussing cases with their clients in multiple languages, court officers helping visitors navigate the building with new respect and patience. A young black law student approached her, clutching a copy of the Bias Impact Report. Dr. Thompson, your story inspired me to focus on judicial reform, she said. I hope to clerk here next year. Maya smiled, remembering her own first encounter with this system. The court will be lucky to have you, she replied. Outside, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Maya stood for a moment, observing the flow of people entering and exiting the building. Each person had their own story, their own encounter with justice, but now they also had something else, a better chance at fair treatment. The stop sign at Maple and 4th Street was still there, still monitoring traffic as it had for years. But now it stood as a silent reminder that change can come from unexpected places, that justice requires vigilance, and that one person's stand against bias can transform an entire system. As Dr. Thompson walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a message. Another court system wanted to implement her program. Another chance to create change. She smiled, knowing that what had started as a simple traffic ticket had become something much more, a movement toward true justice, one courtroom at a time. The change wasn't just in the numbers or the programs or the policies. It was in the hearts and minds of everyone involved in the system. And that, Maya knew, was the most powerful change of all.